Your hair ready?
You know, I prepared it. We went over the notes. Hopefully it will have something intelligent to say at some point. And Ari, thanks as always. It's a pleasure to address the CSB crowd. I wish it were in person, but this is a great gathering. Ari is an unstoppable force in bringing together a great lineup of talks. I'm very honored to be part of such a lineup. Sarah Ben-Or, actually, I've known her for quite a while, and her daughter Ariella and my daughter Mollie are good friends from Camp Ramah of the Rockies. And in fact, just last week, Mollie was at Ariella's Zoom bat mitzvah. So how lovely. You'll enjoy her talk very much, I'm sure. And all of them sound really great. So yes, today's talk doesn't sound like it's as intense as the one that you just had with Arthur Green, but it's about how Jews understand themselves within historical time by looking at, in particular, medieval Jewish mysticism and how medieval Kabbalists, medieval Kabbalah, medieval Jewish mysticism, what was their way of thinking about time, thinking about Jewish history, Jewish historical time, and the place of Jews sort of within the flow of time and within the flow of history. I have a few PowerPoint slides, so let me share that with you. Here you go. Okay, and when thinking about the question of historical time, we should really sort of differentiate between two different ways of thinking about history and thinking about historical time. In one sense, we can think about the telling of history as a kind of chronicling of events. And the historical chronicle, of course, is one, for our purposes, most recognizable genres of the writing of history. This is the one that is the most prominent in the Western, especially sort of post-Enlightenment historical form of history that we all took in high school. Some of us loved it, some of us hated it, right? But where you learn a lot about events that have happened in the past and that this is a form of history. But the historian Jewish historian from Columbia University, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, he pointed out that if we look in Jewish history, there are not that many Jewish historians before the Renaissance. And even then, there was a bit of an uptick in people who did history in the sense of the historical chronicle after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. And then it sort of dropped off again. The far more common type of Jewish historical discourse was really what we would think of more as collective memory, which is Jews talking about what is the nature of or the meaning of Jewish historical experience. They tended not to write and say, first this happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, but instead they tend to write more about what is the religious, theological, Jewish meaning of the events that Jews collectively experience. And this is not to say that Jews are not knowledgeable about the events that happen to Jews collectively. They're not somehow unknowledgeable about Jewish historical experience understood from the perspective of a chronicle, but that wasn't necessarily the thing that they were interested in when it came to writing sacred texts. When it came to writing sacred texts, they tried to situate Jewish collective historical experience within a kind of Jewish sacred history narrative in order to grant meaning to that experience, and often in order to answer some really hard questions, which from the perspective of Jewish history of dealing with exile that persisted for a very long time, and political and social disempowerment, what they had to ask was, how do they make sense of Jewish historical misfortune and lack of their own autonomy and agency in light of the claims of covenantal theology that would say that Jews are God's chosen people, that if they perform the law, God will give them peace, security, and independence in the land of Israel. So if that's not happening, is the Jewish covenant does it still do what it is its intended purpose? And if it is still doing something, what is that? Because it doesn't appear to be taking place on the broader historical plane. And so this is something that medieval Kabbalah, medieval Jewish mysticism, was very interested in. This question about the what is the meaning of Jewish historical collective experience, was something that Kabbalists thought was a very important question to address. They discussed it openly and publicly, even though we think of Kabbalah as a secret discourse. Clearly, Kabbalists were very engaged with these questions and talked about these things in very forthright ways. And in fact, I think that they were one of the most important repositories, and at this point still a sort of understudied repository of evidence for thinking about how Jews historically understood themselves in the flow of history. And so I want to talk about that today, and we'll see that they have a very complex way of understanding historical time, understanding the nature of the universe and the nature of history, and how Jews find their place within that history. Time sort of functions like a map. Anyone who knows me, when I came for CSP, I already had to deal with this. I always needed to have a GPS. I had a terrible sense of direction. I am a horrible navigator, really terrible. I need a map in order to get my way around. I also need a clock, a watch, in order to know what time it is. So calendars, like maps, they help us situate ourselves in time and space, and they help us know what to do. They give us a sense of where am I right now and what is my task. The creation of a collective historical narrative of saying what is the meaning of the experience that a collective undergoes also, in a sense, gives people a sense of not only knowing who they are and where they are and when they are, but also what is happening as they act. What is it that they need to do? What is the benefit of that which they have already done? And what is their sort of path moving forward? So the telling of time in that sense, or the creation of a collective memory, a sacred history, accomplishes this kind of goal. So why didn't Jews write more historical chronicles? Why did they write sacred narratives? And I would argue it has something to do with this sense of giving themselves a place in the historical sweep of time, and giving meaning to their experiences within the scope of history. Let's just take one example of a Kabbalist from the 14th century in Spain. His name was Joseph Angelet, and he wrote an enormous commentary on the Torah. He had a very large commentary just on the book of Genesis. That's 239 folios. So that's, double-sided manuscript pages. It exists in one copy from the 15th century that's held now at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. That's not my background right now, but I have a copy that I took. I created a digital copy when I was there last year, and it's really interesting the way he concludes his commentary on the book of Genesis. He says there that he created it on the 25th day of the month of Av, of the Hebrew month of Av, in the Hebrew year of 5071, which is the year 1311 CE in the Gregorian calendar that we use. He also says it was the 5th year of the Shemitah or sabbatical cycle, which happens every 7 years. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. It's the 33rd year of the Jubilee cycle. We'll talk about what Jubilees and Shemitahs are. It's a law from the Torah. He also says that it's 1,240 years since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Second Temple. And he says it's the 6th year since the exile of the Jews from France. And Jews were indeed exiled 6 years earlier from France. So this is a good example of a Kabbalist from the Middle Ages who had a variety of strategies for thinking about what is his place in time. He does it both in terms of sacred time, the sacred cycles of the sabbatical and the Jubilee. He does it, and those only apply in Israel during the time when the temple stands. But he also does it in terms of Jewish historical time, since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and more locally, he was in eastern Spain, and this is about the exile of the Jews from France. So he's aware of historical events. Jews were not unaware, just because they didn't write chronicles, didn't mean they were unaware of their historical events. But he was part of an elaborate way of creating or situating a sacred historical narrative in order to make sense of Jewish time and Jewish history. So what exactly is then the nature of time, history, and the universe according to sort of the traditional rabbinic view? And even there, if we look in the Talmud and Midrash related literature, the nature of time is a little complicated, and the nature of the universe is not a simple thing of creation at the time of creation, moving through history, and then an endpoint. If we look at, there's a Midrash in Breshit Rabbah that says that, quote, God created worlds and destroyed them before making this world. He said, these please me, these do not please me. So that passage implies that there have been a succession of universes that were created before the creation of this one. There's also a description of multiple concurrent worlds, not just successive worlds one after the other, but also worlds that exist at the same time in a couple of different places in the Talmud and Midrash. There's an interesting passage in the tractate Avodah Zarah in the Talmud on page 3b, where the Gemara asks what God does at night. And it gives the cryptic comment that, quote, he rides upon a swift cherub that flies through 18,000 worlds. And there's another Midrash that also refers to the 18,000 worlds that surround the circumference of this world. So that implies that there are multiple worlds, thousands of worlds, thousands of universes that exist concurrently to this one. It doesn't tell us much about the nature of those worlds. And in another later Midrash, Breshit Rabbati, it says that there are actually 196,000 concurrent worlds or universes with this one. So how do they then think about time? Let's look at a few passages here from the Talmud. This is Tractate Sanhedrin in a passage that talks a lot about the nature of historical time and messianic redemption. And there it says that, you see, the world will exist for 6,000 years and be desolate for 1,000 years, as it is written, and the Lord alone shall be exalted on that day. And so they refer to this as like, just as the sabbatical year abrogates debts once every 7 years, so too the world is abrogated 1,000 out of every 7,000 years. So does this happen in a cycle of worlds? Is there a generation and destruction over time? Meaning if the world exists for 6,000 years and is desolate for 1,000, is it then recreated at the end of that? The Talmud isn't entirely clear, at least in this passage, on that particular point. But it's interesting that in the 12th century, there was a philosopher, a Jewish philosopher, who was very influenced by certain types of Islamic philosophy that built on certain aspects of Greek philosophy, who said that the world actually exists in cycles of 7,000 years, and that each 7,000 years is governed by one of the 7 planets. And that culminates at the end of 49,000 years into a sort of destruction and then regeneration of the world. And a view similar to that emerges later in Kabbalah. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's clear that there were complex notions about time in Rabbinic Judaism. In the Second Temple, the Book of Jubilees talks a lot about cyclical versions of time and a cyclical recycling of the process of creation and destruction of the universe. This complicated way of thinking about time and thinking about the universe takes on sort of a religious character when we think of it in light of the doctrine in the Torah of the sabbatical and the jubilee. The sabbatical, also referred to as the Shemitah, is the idea that every 7th year, no agricultural work is to be done. The fields are allowed to lie fallow, and people are supposed to live on either food that was collected during the previous 6 years, or from whatever grows naturally from their fields. And they also argue that debts are to be forgiven or released during this period. So whenever someone borrows money, they're borrowing it only until the point of the next Shemitah. And at that point, those debts are forgiven. Land is allowed to lie fallow. It's sort of like a Sabbath that happens once every 7 days. It's a Sabbath for the fields that happens once every 7 years. This doesn't apply to all agriculture that Jews engage in everywhere. It only applies to agriculture that happens in the land of Israel while the temple is standing. The Yovel, or Jubilee, so the sabbatical in Hebrew is a Shemitah, the Jubilee is a Yovel. This happens every 7th sabbatical. So at the end of every 49th year, there is the Jubilee, the 50th year, which adds the extra provision of property returning to its original owner. So the sale of land, as it was allocated to the families of the different tribes as they came into the land of Canaan, was supposed to return to the family that originally owned it. Sale of land was actually a temporary lease from one family to another, and everything would then go back to as it was at the Jubilee year, so that no one would ever be permanently dispossessed from their family inheritance, their inheritable land. And all Israelite slaves are to be released at the time of the Jubilee as well. So an Israelite slave was actually a kind of long-term worker, and they become freed at the time of the Jubilee. So this is a sort of agricultural and economic form of sevens that recur. In addition to the 7 days of the week, there are the 7 years of the sabbatical or Shemitah, and then there are the 7 sevens that happens in the 50th year of the Jubilee. So now what's interesting is, when are we? If there is a cycle of sevens or of 7,000s, how do Kabbalists understand not just where we are, but when we are? So let's look at this chart of the 10 Sfirot. This is a chart of the Kabbalistic idea of the 10 luminous emanations that they believe are emanated from the divine nothing, or the Ein Sof, the endlessness of God's essence. And they are 10 entities. They're called Sfirot from the word, it comes from the verbal root for sapir, which means luminous. So where we get the word sapphire. It also refers to the narrations or the enumerations in Hebrew of the divine inner self. So these 10 aspects of God, these 10 luminous emanations, are all part of God. They're sort of the paradoxical 10 that is one. And these 10 aspects of God all have different divine names. We don't need to talk about what those are, but you can see them here in Hebrew on this handwritten chart of imagining what the 10 Sfirot look like, which is from a manuscript also held at the Oxford Library. I don't know if I have copyright to show this to you, so don't redistribute. And this map of the Sfirot shows that, sort of coming down from the top, there are this sort of flow. The flow merges from the top Sfirah Keter to Chochmah, divine wisdom, Bina, divine apprehension. So it goes down through the different Sfirot down to the final Sfirah, Malchut, or the Shekhinah, which then connects to the physical world. And it creates a continuum of being that stretches all the way from the divine endlessness, the divine Ein Sof, all the way to the physical world. But this map of the Sfirot, this chart of the Sfirot, also has within it the notion that the lower 7 Sfirot, the top 3 are considered very transcendent, but the lower 7 are comparable to the 7 days of the week. Hopefully you can see my cursor moving there. And they're also seen as comparable to 7 successive Shmitot. But this doctrine of the Shemitah, or the sabbatical, is the idea that the universe exists in a succession of universes that persist for 7,000 years. And that each universe of 7,000 years, each world, is governed not by one of the 7 planets, but by one of the 7 lower Sfirot. And it takes on the character of that Sfirah. So, for instance, the world that just passed was governed by the Sfirah of Chesed, or divine judgment. Of divine justice. And so this universe was one in which no evil occurrences happened. There was no such thing as the evil inclination. There was nothing bad happened. It was a very luminous, immaterial, divine world in which everything went exactly according to plan. There's some disagreement among Kabbalists originally in terms of which Sfirah governs the current universe in which Jews find themselves, but it quickly becomes, by the mid-14th century, that most Kabbalists agree that we are currently in the universe of the Sphira of Gvura, or Din, which is harsh or strict divine justice, or divine judgment. This is considered a Sphira associated with evil occurrences in the world. And so therefore, the current world is one that has all kinds of bad things associated with it. Exile of the Jewish people, Jewish disempowerment, famine, plague, war, and the evil inclination that leads people to sin, as well as this is a universe that is much more material or physical in character. And that's the character of this Sphira, because it is, of this universe, because it is the character of that Sphira to create such a world. So within the cosmic flow of time, this is actually in some ways the worst of all possible worlds. The assumption is that when the world moves on to the next Sphira, Tiferet, that will be a much better world. But you have to go through the cycling of this universe, they say, a period that will last into the 7th millennium. So the first 6,000 years, at the end of the first 6,000 years, somewhere towards that period, to the end of the first 6,000, the Messiah will come. And then in the 7,000, the last 1,000 years of the 7,000 cycle, in the 7th millennium, peace will reign, messianic redemption will be at hand. And then the world will be annihilated and recreated under the control of the next Sphira, of the next divine emanation. What's interesting is that they regard all of these worlds that happen in these 7 worlds that happen in succession from one another, and they take this to be sort of like the comment from Breshit Rabbah, that the worlds that the God creates and destroys worlds, that at the end of each 7,000 years, the world is sort of reassimilated into God and then recreated again. And it's recreated in very different ways. And that in each world, each period of 7,000 years, the Torah takes on a new character. So the Torah of the Sphira of Chesed, the world that just passed, was very different than this one. They say it involved no prohibitions. It didn't have any laws about purity or impurity, because it was a different world that Jews lived in. And therefore, the nature of the Torah itself was very, very different. Same for the next world, Tiferet. The Torah will be different at that time. They actually connect this with the idea that when the Messiah comes and a new letter, a Hebrew letter, will be revealed on the side of the tefillin box. There's actually a little tradition sort of like this. There's on one side of the tefillin shel rosh, the tefillin that goes on the head, there is a letter shin that has 3 arms, the standard letter shin on one side, and it has 4 arms on the other. And they say, well, that means that this new letter will be introduced, and therefore all the words will be different, all the meanings will be different, and the Torah will be different. This is a pretty radical idea, but it was one that was broadly shared by Kabbalists, that in these different worlds, in these different historical epochs, the Torah will be different, human experience will be different, everything about the world will be different. And we just happen to live in a moment that is particularly difficult and challenging. So obviously this is a way of thinking about history that is not a beat about the nature of the current state of the universe. But by regarding the world as being in a very flawed state, or at very least that this is a universe that is governed by a divine attribute that creates a particular kind of cosmos, a particular kind of reality that Jews have to navigate, it helps account for the misfortunes of Jewish historical experience. When Jews wonder, has God abandoned us? We're trying to perform his law, and yet we're expelled from Spain, we're expelled from England, things are going really badly. Let's not forget what happened to Jews during the Crusades. Let's not forget what happened to Jews after the bubonic plague, where terrible, terrible acts of mass murder occurred in the 14th century. At the end of the 14th century, in 1391, in one summer, 100,000 Jews were killed in mass violence uprising in Spain. That was the largest mass murder event against Jews before the Holocaust. It's horrible, right? Certainly, it would be a problem to tell the history of medieval Jewry in Europe as being just a succession of misfortunes. And the historian Salo Baron from Columbia University suggested many years ago that we have to resist what he calls the lachrymose narrative of Jewish history. Not every moment in every place was just a tale of woe and destruction. But we should also bear in mind that there was an awful lot of historical misfortune and setback that medieval Jews had to think about, even if they were experiencing a moment of relative peace in their own immediate circumstance. They had to make sense of historical misfortune, of things that had happened before their time or things that had happened during their lifetimes, but somewhere not immediately where they lived. And making sense of that was a difficult thing to do. One of the suggestions Kabbalists offer is that it's just the nature of the cosmos itself that this particular manifestation of the world is under one of the sphirot that leads to a world filled with misfortune. They also argue that this world wasn't supposed to be nearly as bad as it is now, but history went off the rails right at the very beginning with the sin of Adam and Eve. And they argue that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, that this led to a catastrophic change in the nature of reality, that human beings lost their luminous bodies of light and were instead given physical bodies, that Adam and Eve developed and conveyed to their all subsequent human generations the evil inclination, which has led to nothing but problems. And they argue that Jews undergoing, or at least the Israelites undergoing historical exile, for instance, the exile in the land of Egypt, was designed to purify their souls so that they could then return to God and recreate a universe that was as it was intended. It would still be a universe under the sphira of Din, of harsh divine judgment, but it would be much better than the one we're experiencing now. And that they by undergoing historical misfortune in Egypt, their souls were purified and they were ready to have the universe be brought back on track until the sin of the golden calf, which put everything off kilter again. And that Jews still live in the legacy of these moments of Jewish transgression that continue to delay the ability to recapture what had been God's intended formation of humanity at the time of creation. So it is the legacy of these moments of Eden and of the sin of the golden calf at Mount Sinai that has led to a world filled with misfortune and filled with Jewish misfortune. They also argue that by Jews performing Jewish law, they will push and nudge history in the proper direction, bringing it to its final culmination, which is ironically a kind of reclamation of creation as it was meant to be, creation as God wanted it to be at the time of the creation in the Garden of Eden, and that will be the world in its proper and most ideal form. And so by performing Jewish law, it's not only is it not ineffective, it's highly effective, but in ways that people don't realize, because the Kabbalists argue that when Jews perform Jewish law, they move history towards its proper culmination, which will be the messianic redemption of the Jews, the sort of changing of the nature of the universe itself to be a world in which there is no evil inclination, a world in which, the lion lies down with the wolf lies down with the lamb, right? That, and of course, one in which Jews are brought back to the land of Israel, the temple is rebuilt, universal peace reigns throughout humanity, and the world would be categorically different than it is now. In a sense, it would be the end of history, at least the end of history as we know it. It would be a world without wars, a world without famine, plague, and all of the kinds of things, especially human conflicts between different groups, that are the cause of and the makers of, the drivers of what we think of as history, at least the type we tell in historical chronicles. Now, all of these different aspects of the different universes, while they're mostly separated from each other, they argue that there are little elements of each of them that are present in the others. So the Sabbath is like a taste of one of the better universes that visits this world. They also argue, interestingly, that Enoch, Abraham, and Moses were from the previous universe, the previous Shemitah of Chesed, of divine kindness. And that, therefore, that's why Abraham, in particular Moses, the giver of the Torah is seen as a kind of visitation from another universe that brings elements of a much better reality into this world. And even though the Torah in this world takes on a different character, it's still the Torah of the world of Din, the world of strict divine justice. It is, they see it, a much better or a much sort of easier world. So now one of the questions is what happens at the end of these 49,000 years? And so they argue that at the end of the final Sirah of Malchut or Shekhinah, the divine presence, at the end of that universe of 7,000 years, everything returns to the divine mother, divine knowledge, Binah, the third Sirah, and is sort of annihilated there. So now some would say that's the end of the universe. Everything goes back up to God at the end of a cycle of 49,000 years. Others argue, no, the world is recreated again, and the same succession happens over and over again. Some say it happens 18,000 times, so there's 18,000 jubilees, 18,000 cycles of 7 sevens. Others argue that there are 882,000 of these, so there's quite a few different jubilees. And still others say that this is a cycle that goes on eternally and never really ends. There isn't a lot of agreement about that. But it actually even gets more complex than that. If the details of this are a little complicated, don't worry about that. There's the argument that time slows down towards the end of each Shemitah, the end of each universe of 7,000 years. One Kabbalist from the 14th century argues that because when you get towards the end of a Shemitah, time slows down so that people can enjoy the perfection that happens towards the end of the Shemitah when the sabbatical comes, that the duration of the current Shemitah will actually be in human years 17,896,270,000 human years. That's actually longer than estimates of the existence of the physical universe as we understand it today. So in a sense, they say, in Einstein's term, time is relative. It depends on who you are and where you are. It's not the same for everyone. They also say that the undergoing of exile happens not only for humans collectively, like Jews being exiled from the land of Israel and hoping to return again, but they argue that exile happens over the course of many lifetimes. For those of you who are there at the talk about reincarnation, they say there's exile of the sort of the body, the exile that happens as Jews experience exile in Egypt, or exile after the destruction of the temple, exile into Europe, into the lands of Edom in Christian territory, or the lands of Ishmael in Islamic territory. But they say that the exile of the individual soul happens through reincarnation over the course of many lifetimes. And so this exile of the soul happens as people are reincarnated as different people, either as reincarnated as Jews, reincarnated as Gentiles, or reincarnated as animals. Again, be nice to the rabbits, because that is the reincarnation that one has as a punishment for committing idolatry. To look at another interesting discussion about these multiple worlds that happen, is that not only are there many worlds that follow upon one another in this long succession of worlds that then culminate in the return of all of the Sefirot to Binah, and then the further emanation of them and back down through the lower 7 Sefirot again. They argue, and this is from a book called the Sefer HaTmunah, which talked a lot about this complex nature of time, multiple successive universes. They also talk about multiple simultaneous universes. And this book, Sefer HaTmunah, was written somewhere in the mid-14th century in the Byzantine Empire, probably modern-day Greece. And it says the following. It says, as you see here, in each Sefirah and each Shemitah, there are many wondrous worlds, with orbits and Shemitot and Jubilees in each and every Sefirah, within which are other worlds, this within that and this within that. Some of them large, some small, some composite, some simple, some pure, and others luminous. All of them are wondrous, supernal, and hidden, with secret and concealed laws and statutes in the myriads of thousands and without number. So now, of course, here when it refers to the secret laws and statutes, it's referring to the different types of universes that exist and the different manifestations of the Torah that take shape in each of these different universes, and that these are all happening within one one particular Shemitah. And of course, then there are many different Shemitot that happen successively. Within any given Shemitah, they argue that there is literally a countless number of successive universes in the same space. So I'm going to stop screen share now and just sort of think about where this leaves us in terms of how Kabbalists understood time, how they understood Jews in the flow of history, which has its many ups and downs. Human fortune is ruled by cosmic forces. First, that's clearly very important to them, and that the current eon is one that's really disastrous, and that helps explain Jewish misfortune and the misfortunes of humanity. Space encompasses many multitudes, and that there are many different alternative universes that are happening even at the same time as this one, with many different Torahs. So there are always, of course, many different possible universes, and that Jews just happen to live in one that is very, very difficult and harsh. This idea of the multiverse has actually had something of an important rehabilitation in the modern period. The late Stephen Hawking was a big advocate of the idea of a multiverse. But we should remember, Kabbalists were not theoretical physicists. They were not trying to understand what is the nature of time and space in a purely theoretical sense. They wanted to understand what is the nature of Jewish experience. And their main interest then was understanding sort of how to find the meaning of Jewish history. This is part of our question of how do Jews tell their history? How do they understand the meaning of history? And these complex ways of thinking about time and space were part of how they tried to make sense of where they were and when they were, by saying that historical setbacks for the Jewish people were in some senses inevitable because of the nature of the cosmos itself. That the cosmos has in fact gone awry. The nature of time and the nature of space has been changed because of the sin of Adam and Eve, because of the sin that happened not only in the Garden of Eden, but at Mount Sinai with the golden calf. That Jews are now heroically carrying forward history towards its full conclusion, which will be fulfilling its original intention of a universe that enables people to function according to divine will, but to do so without the evil inclination and all of the negative historical forces that happen as the result of that. In that way, they can say Jewish law is doing something. It's just not entirely apparent yet. But when history reaches its unveiling, its dramatic denouement, what will happen is that the role that Jews play in history will be made plain to everyone, that the people who appear to be the big history makers, the Muslim world, the Christian world, medieval Kabbalists argue that's not where real history is happening. Real history is happening in the synagogues, in the homes of Jews observing Jewish law. It's happening in the schools where Jewish school children are being taught the Hebrew language, the Hebrew alphabet. It's happening in the study halls and in the places where Jews are living Jewish life, who are persisting despite historical setback in fulfilling the mandates of somehow getting along as Jews in the world. In a sense, what they see Judaism doing is pushing history towards the end of history, towards a different reality, and pushing the cosmos forward in its cycling of these different manifestations of divine reality in the world. And as for the multiverse, that's a really interesting question. I'm reminded of the Philip Pullman series, The Golden Compass, which has actually recently been remade as a dramatic series on HBO called His Dark Materials. I've been watching it with my younger daughter. It's really great. And there's this theory of multiple universes that are happening at the same time in the same space, and only a few people can actually figure out how to go between them. In fact, it takes place in the city of Oxford, my favorite library. And there, they argue that the magisterium, sort of loosely based on a Christian notion of religious authority, that the magisterium is horrified at the thought of multiple universes, because in the alternate universe from this one that the story takes place in, the magisterium is the most powerful entity. And for them to imagine that there are other universes means that there are worlds that are outside of their control, and they don't like that idea. Kabbalists seem to have a really different way of thinking about this. For Kabbalists, the notion of multiple universes thrills them. They're incredibly excited by the idea that there are multiple universes and multiple Torahs, maybe even infinite number, all happening at the same time. In a sense, it's an age-old human feeling of a longing for another world, a different world that's different from this one. But it's also a claim that Jews have tremendous secret or power, secret knowledge that's powerful, secret knowledge about the nature of the universe, secret knowledge about the many different manifestations of things that happen. It situates Jewish experience in such a complicated timeline of many universes happening one after the other, as well as a complicated notion of the universes, of many universes also happening simultaneous to one another, that one's individual traumas seem small in a sense. And what they argue is, don't worry about your local particular traumas. What you are part of is this grand cosmic scheme in which the observance of the Torah by Jews really does push the universe and history forward to its proper fulfillment, correcting these flaws that have happened in the nature of historical time as a result of sin, and redirecting history towards its proper conclusion. Therefore, Jews are doing something very powerful, not just for this world, but something that's part of a cycle of many worlds, happening one after another and also happening at the same time. So in this sense, Judaism becomes a matter of cosmic importance. History is in fact what is temporary, because history comes to its conclusion when Judaism reaches its fulfillment. And in the meantime, Jews suffering historical setback is, ironically, part of the way that history properly moves forward. It's part of the way that Jews push history towards its ultimate conclusion. Knowledge of these secrets, therefore, was a kind of gift that Kabbalah offered medieval Jews. And based on the enormous success of this form of Judaism, the Kabbalistic form of Judaism in the Middle Ages, this was clearly a gift that many Jews were happy to receive, one that gave them a sense of where they were, of when they were, and a new discourse for imagining Jewish purpose. So those are my thoughts and comments about multiple worlds and historical epochs in medieval Jewish mysticism. I'm very happy to take any questions, observations that you might have.
Well, thank you. That was a lot for us to think about now. We have a lot to think about this week and this month. People are asking questions and I will share them shortly. I guess basically what you're telling me is that Marvel Comics did not make up the multiverse.
No.
Okay. So here's some questions. Let's go. How well known were the concepts you just talked to us about the cycle of these universes and what universe we were in throughout the Jewish world? Was it kept to a small group of people who studied these things, or was it kind of shared broadly?
So in some circumstances, it seems to me that clearly Jews were sharing this pretty broadly. But so, I mean, if you ask someone who is interested in Kabbalah today, they'll know about the doctrine of the Shemitot. But I've seen people discussing it in 14th century sermons. So sermonic literature, it seems these were things that actually were offered as public discourses in synagogues. And they're talking about the fact that we live under the harsh and evil Shemitah of the Sphira of Din. So the sabbatical cycle of the universe, of this aspect of the divine associated with harsh judgment, is one that many Jews seem to talk about as though this was a well-known thing. Because Kabbalah becomes less prominent among Ashkenazi Jews in the 19th and 20th century, at least non-Hasidic Ashkenazi Jews, we think of this as a sort of obscure doctrine. But in pre-modern circles, I think it was relatively well known. I wish I could say more about how well known, but it was certainly not terribly obscure.
Now, we all know that, I mean, our planet, at least, I don't know about the universe, will be disappearing. I don't know when it is, but it is happening. So this whole concept of the destruction of what we know as our universe, our Earth, is actually scientific. So it's interesting how that does tie into this Kabbalistic theory. Lizanne asks, do we know where the Kabbalists got these ideas from? Generally, what we've learned in Jewish history is that we take from what we learned in our society. We don't generally, I mean, we have some unique ideas, maybe they're Jewish, but generally we take ideas that are floating around the 14th century and then we make them uniquely Jewish. So where did these ideas of the cycles and the cycle we're in and recycling. Is that uniquely Jewish, or does it come from other traditions?
So it's not uniquely Jewish. I see Lizanne was also interested in like the 18,000 worlds. That's in the Talmud. We're not sure what made them think of that. I mean, 18 is an important number, so 18,000, because 18 is the numerical value of the word chai, life. In terms of the cycling of the universe, as I mentioned, Abraham Bar Chia in the 12th century seems to be drawing this from the Ismaili sources, which is a particular subset of Islamic thinking in the Middle Ages. And they were very interested in a kind of version from Greek philosophy. And there, the idea of a sort of cycle of 7,000s that culminates at the end of 49,000, that was how they understood historical time or cosmic time. So they clearly are riffing on that, but they render it much more directly as a way of thinking about Jewish experience and thinking about the nature of the performance of Jewish law. To then put that in the context of kind of endless cycles of the universe and multiple universes at the same time, it's hard to say whether the Jewish tradition is the innovator or the adopter there. It's usually some combination of both. But there is no obvious, examples of other people in the immediate Jewish environment talking about this. We do see examples of complicated ways of thinking about time, space, and multiple universes in some forms of Brahmanic Hindu thought. So this is a thing that's out there in the world. And I'm not sure exactly where, if we can say that there's a location of where Jews get it, or it's just part of something that Jews are talking about and other people are talking about, and they're talking about it with each other. In terms of the claims that Kabbalists make, they claim that this is all part of a Kabbalistic tradition that goes from Moses on Mount Sinai that was given to Moses by God. So they argue that this is knowledge exclusive to Jews, that is divine in origin, not rational in origin. It's not something they figured out. It's something that's been handed down to them through the Kabbalistic tradition, stemming from revelation on Mount Sinai.
Jeff Kaufman and Arnold Sugarman asked the question, and I'm sure others ask as well. Well, let me put it in this way. The good news is, if you're living in the 14th century and you're suffering horrible things, this is a great thing to understand your reality. The bad news is that means that if you're living somewhere safe, somewhere else, you're still stuck in this reality, i.e., what happened to freedom of choice? It seems like if you're stuck in a cycle, you are predestined to either suffer or not suffer, irrespective of anything you do. You may be able to, I guess, hasten or get us to the end of a cycle. I don't exactly know how we can change the world, but you're kind of stuck. So isn't that the bad news? I mean, where is free choice? You're stuck.
Yeah, it is interesting to say that many of the misfortunes that happen are as a result of things well beyond any individual Jew's control, and that in fact the universe has gone awry. Transgressions in Eden and at Sinai have led to this sort of altered reality, and it also makes it seem like the arrival of the Messiah is somewhat predestined. Although they argue that the ushering in of the Messianic era can happen at an earlier date if Jews are better at fulfilling Jewish law. But it does make Jews sort of seem like they are stuck on this spider web of misfortune. But that is the nature of one's experience, right? That the world is a very imperfect place, even if you're living in a relatively good circumstance. Like, look, Jews in America have had a pretty good run, even though there's anti-Semitism and things like that I shouldn't, we should never minimize. In terms of the scope of Jewish history, Jewish experience in North America has been really good. And yet we still struggle with the question of the misfortunes that Jews have experienced over the course of their history. We have to make sense of it. So this way of seeing the world acknowledges that many terrible things happen in the world. This is a very imperfect world. And it suggests that that's because the structure of the cosmos is very complicated, and that is the reason why this world takes on the character that it does. But that there are lots of other worlds out there, before this one, after this one, maybe even simultaneous to this one, that are better possible universes that we are sort of stuck in a difficult world. But I think that historically, if you ask people, do you think you're in the best of all possible universes? Most people will say no. Most people will say, look, I love my family, I love my immediate circumstance, but no, I can say clearly that there are a lot of really bad things in the world that are so terrible that I have a hard time reconciling that with the notion of a loving God who rewards people for the performance of his law. And so Kabbalists were well aware of that. And this was a way of grappling with that very deep philosophical and personal question by acknowledging, yes, this is a problematic world. The nature of the world in which you find yourself is flawed and involves a lot of human misery. But there is a way that you can push things forward towards a collective reparation of that, and that it empowers Jewish observance to be part of that process.
And just to make sure I understand, we're all in this together. So Jews and non-Jews and Muslims and Christians and Jews, we're all in this cycle.
Everyone's in the cycle together. Now, Jews tended to see Christians, Muslims, other non-Jews as instruments of divine sort of exacting punishment against Jews in order to refine their souls and help push history forward in that way. But they do see Jews as the instrument that will lead to a kind of redemption of the era, a redemption of this eon for everyone.
So that's our role as Jews in this understanding. We understand the nature of the universe, and we can help get to the next better universe and take everybody with us.
Yeah, and well, one Kabbalist from the late 15th, early 16th century, Meir Ibn Gabbai, he talks about non-Jews being able to go to the Olam Haba, or the world to come, that non-Jews do have a share in what happens in the future if they follow the 7 Noahide laws, the 7 laws of the children of Noah. Jews have a lot more laws to follow, so in a sense their burden is heavier. But that, yes, the sort of the future shape of the world is one. This is actually something that's interesting in the research I'm doing now. What is the role for non-Jews in the world in the future? And that's an interesting question. But the non-Jews and Jews will all enjoy the fruits of that labor.
Last question, Jeff Kaufman or Mary Craft ask if you know about a expert in the multiverse, David Deutsch, a physicist, mathematician at Oxford. They want to know if you know who he is, and if you had a chance to discuss this with him.
I wish I had. No, I do know who David Deutsch is, but
would you like an introduction?
That'd be great.
Okay,
he's
Jeff,
interested in
Mary,
the actual. He's interested in like the actual multiverse. I don't know if he's interested in like the history of people talking about the idea of the multiverse. I can't claim any knowledge of like actual multiverses, but the if he's interested in Jewish mystical literature's engagement with something of the sort, there is a kind of interesting, an interesting history of science element to it for sure.
My final question is, so you mentioned that there are some figures in our tradition that this Kabbalistic concepts, say, come from a different part, like you mentioned Enoch, Abraham, and Moshe, right? Enoch, Abraham,
sort of
Moses.
Aliens from another.
So where, like, is there something we can read about this? Like, I mean, where does this come up in the literature so we can check it out and see what they say?
So this is in medieval Kabbalistic texts where they make mention of this. Most of them are in Hebrew, but yeah, they do talk about the idea of those 3 characters. They don't say that much about it, just that they come from the previous Shemitah of Chesed. I think that they're saying, look, they're good examples of what divine loving kindness looks like. Someone asked here an interesting question: what did the Vilna Gaon think about these notions? I'm not sure if he speaks about them directly or not, but he embraced most Kabbalistic ideas and probably would embrace the notion that Jewish life, Jewish history takes place in the Shemitah of Din, of harsh divine judgment, and that accounts for Jewish historical misfortune.
Sure does explain a lot about our history for the last few thousand years. When is this period over? What's the date? Do you have that for us?
Well, that's up to us. Yeah, we can speed the end.
Well, assuming
right.
I mean, look around the world, we're not doing a good job of speeding up anything. In fact, we seem to be pushing things backwards. But so if we don't do anything, when is this over? What have you calculated?
There's a lot of different calculations that Kabbalists have offered. So far, none of them have come true yet. But that the initiation of the beginning of the end would certainly happen by early after the year 6000.
Where are we now? 5781?
Yeah.
So if you guys stick around for about 200 years, we're going to be there, right? Is that, can we end with that?
Yeah, that's all you got to do is stick around that long.
I will say that I was talking to Hartley before about Kabbalistic texts, and he said the Kabbalah says those of you who join CSP Legacy Circle are guaranteed the world to come and will be part of this whole opportunity. So I didn't say it, Hartley said it, and Hartley's the expert in Kabbalistic literature, so I have to take it in Hartley's perspective that CSP and legacy makes a difference, and maybe you will speed up this cycle. So maybe it won't be 200 years. It'll be much less than that. So think about that when you get an email from me about our CSP Legacy Circle. Any last words, Hartley?
No, except that it's a pleasure as always to see the familiar and new faces with CSP, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Jan, for joining us from the Hub. And our programs are on a share site called the Hub, so we're getting all new people. So if you're new to CSP, welcome. If you don't know about us, go to occsp.net. If you need more information, you call Irene. And if you live in Manchester, England, you drop by Irene's house, but wear a mask, and she'll tell you more about CSP. With that, I guess we'll have a day off from CSP. We'll see you guys with Justin Cami on Thursday. Okay? You can wave. Good to see you. A lot to think about. At least you understand what multiverse you're in. When you read the comics, know that it's all true. It comes from Kabbalistic text. I like to see what outfits Moses, Abraham, and Enoch wear when they travel through the multiverse, the universes. It's a good comic.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
My kids would read the comics.
A different, Shemitah of Chesed style with them.
They look different. Well, I'd be interested to know. You have to email me if anybody besides Hartley knew anything about this. Maybe Ahuva knew about it. I don't know. I just this is relatively new to me. Maybe Susan Glass knows. I don't know. Rona, you seem very educated. Gary Myers, I think Gary knows. Browers, they tend to know because the Browers are probably from the other multiverse, the other universe. They're very nice people. Maybe that's it. Like the people like the Browers probably came from the different universe. That explains a lot. So Hartley, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That explains a lot to me. Bye, guys. Have a good one. Good to see you. Bye, Grosses. If you guys see a video, by the way, Hartley, you have to look at Amy's video. Are you on Facebook?
Almost never, actually.
That's good for you. I'm going to send you a video. The Grosses enjoy it. My wife made a video, and I was pulled into it. You got to watch it. It's about life, living with kids during a year of the pandemic. I'll send you the video. You'll see, but it is trending apparently today.
All right, great. No,
on social media. So
relate.
Thank you, everybody. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks.